The doctor's waiting room smelled like stale coffee and hand sanitizer when I first decided to become someone I wasn't. My son Marcus sat beside me, scrolling through his phone, completely unaware that the mother he thought was slipping away could still count every lie that left his mouth. I'd heard him on the phone 2 nights before, voice low in the kitchen. He assumed I couldn't navigate anymore. "She won't remember anyway," he'd told someone, probably his wife Jennifer. That sentence changed everything. I wasn't losing my mind. I was about to lose my home, my savings, and my dignity if I didn't act fast. So I made a choice that morning, one that would require me acting skills I didn't know I possessed, and a commitment that would stretch across 6 long months. If they wanted to believe I was fading, I'd give them exactly what they expected, and I'd document every single word they said when they thought I couldn't understand. Maybe you've faced something similar where you live. If so, subscribe and tell me your state in the comments, because what happened next proved I wasn't alone in this fight. Marcus finally looked up from his phone when the nurse called my name. I let my hand tremble slightly as I reached for my purse, not overdoing it, but enough that he noticed. His eyebrows pulled together with what I wanted to believe was genuine concern, but had started to recognize as calculated observation. "Mom, you okay?" he asked, his voice pitched just slightly louder than normal, the way people speak to foreigners or children. I nodded slowly, letting my eyes go just a bit unfocused before sharpening again. "Fine, fine," I murmured, deliberately slurring the second word just enough. The nurse smiled sympathetically, and Marcus stood, placing his hand on my elbow with a gentleness that might have fooled me a week ago. But I'd already ordered the voice-activated recorder online, had already started my private notebook with dates and times, had already begun building the case that would eventually sit in front of a notary with my family's shocked faces as witnesses. The appointment lasted 30 minutes, and the doctor found nothing wrong with my cognition, just as I knew he would. The ride home was when Marcus made his first mistake. He took a call on speakerphone, something he'd never done before when I was in the car. Jennifer's voice filled the Lexus I'd helped them buy 3 years ago, sharp and eager. "So what did the doctor say?" she asked. Marcus glanced at me in the rearview mirror, saw me staring blankly out the window like I'd been practicing, and his shoulders relaxed. "Nothing definitive yet, but she's definitely declining. Got confused about what year it is. Couldn't remember her own address during intake." I had, in fact, recited both perfectly, but the nurse had been interrupted by a phone call, and Marcus had apparently decided to revise history immediately. My hand rested in my lap, the new recorder tucked in my cardigan pocket, still in its Amazon packaging. But the old iPhone I told Marcus was too complicated now sat recording in my purse, voice memos app activated before we'd even left the house. Conversation number 1, I thought. Only 846 more to go. That evening I made dinner like I had every Sunday for 40 years, except this time I let the pot boil over just slightly. Marcus and Jennifer exchanged a look across my kitchen table that I caught in the reflection of the window over the sink. "Mom, maybe you should sit down," Jennifer suggested, her voice dripping with false sweetness that made my teeth ache. I waved her off, splashing a bit more water than necessary. The recorder sat in my apron pocket now, transferred from the cardigan, catching every word as they lowered their voices behind me. "We need to move faster," Jennifer whispered, not quite quietly enough, "before she signs anything over to that animal shelter she keeps talking about." I'd mentioned the shelter exactly once, 3 months ago, testing whether Marcus even listened anymore. Apparently he'd shared it with his wife as intelligence worth tracking. I served the pot roast, slightly overdone on purpose, and watched them eat while discussing my deterioration, as if I wasn't sitting right there. The recorder captured it all, time-stamped and clear, the first brick in a wall I was building that they couldn't see yet. My daughter Rachel called Tuesday morning, and I let it ring 4 times before answering, something I'd never done before. "Mom, Marcus said you're having trouble," she started, her voice tight with worry that felt genuine. Rachel had always been the gentler one, the child who sent cards and called weekly even after she'd moved to Portland for work. I wanted to tell her everything right then, to recruit her as an ally, but something made me hesitate. "Trouble?" I repeated, adding a tremor that hurt my throat to produce. "No trouble, sweetie. Everything's fine." She was silent for a moment, and I could almost hear her processing, comparing notes with whatever Marcus had told her. "That's good, Mom. That's really good. Listen, I'm coming home next month for a visit, okay? We'll have lunch, just us girls." I agreed and ended the call, then immediately played it back on my phone. Her concern sounded real, but she hadn't questioned Marcus's assessment, hadn't defended my faculties or demanded to know what specific symptoms he'd observed. 3 days later, Marcus called her back, on speakerphone again, in my living room, while I pretended to nap on the couch. That conversation became number 12 in my growing collection. The notebook I kept hidden in the flour canister started filling up faster than I expected. Every morning I recorded the date, the conversation number, and key quotes that made my hand shake with real anger as I wrote. Marcus told his business partner I'd left the stove on overnight, a complete fabrication. Jennifer informed her mother that I'd called her by the wrong name 4 times in 1 week. Never happened. My son-in-law Derek, Rachel's husband, apparently heard I'd gotten lost driving to the grocery store I'd been visiting for 30 years. Pure invention. Each lie built on the last, creating a narrative of decline that would have been convincing if it had any basis in reality. But they didn't know about the daily crossword puzzles I completed in pen, the mystery novels I devoured each week, the chess games I played online against strangers who had no idea I was supposed to be losing my mind. The most painful entries in my notebook weren't the lies, though. They were the casual cruelties, the way they discussed liquidating my assets, selling my house, and placing me in a facility with the same tone they might use to debate vacation destinations. By week 3, I'd established a routine that would have been exhausting if it wasn't fueled by pure fury. Mornings I spent being confused about small things, the day of the week, whether I'd had breakfast, the name of my neighbor's dog I'd known for a decade. Marcus started visiting more frequently, always with that clipboard he thought I didn't notice, taking notes on my supposed confusion like a researcher documenting a fascinating decline. Afternoons I spent in my bedroom with the door locked, transcribing recordings, backing everything up to the cloud account Marcus didn't know existed, and researching elder law with a focus that would have made my late husband Henry proud. He'd been an attorney, and I'd absorbed more during our 40-year marriage than anyone realized. I knew about competency hearings, conservatorships, and undue influence. I knew that what they were building toward wasn't just morally wrong, it was legally actionable. And I knew that documentation was everything. Henry used to say that paper had patience that people lacked, that the written record would outlast emotion and faulty memory. He was right. The paper, or in this case, the digital recordings, was about to become my weapon. The symbolic object that would eventually tie everything together came into focus during week 4, though I didn't recognize its full significance at first. My mother's cameo brooch, the one she'd worn at her own wedding in 1943, sat in a velvet box in my jewelry drawer. Jennifer had admired it exactly once, 6 years ago, with an intensity that had made me uncomfortable even then. On a Thursday morning, I came downstairs to find her in my bedroom, the drawer open, the brooch in her hand. "Oh, you're awake," she said, startled but recovering quickly. "I was just looking for your insurance papers. Marcus said you might need them soon." I let my face go slack, nodded slowly, and she slipped the brooch back with exaggerated casualness. But the recorder in the smoke detector I'd installed last week, one of 4 now positioned throughout my house, caught what she muttered to herself as she closed the drawer. "Probably worth $6,000, maybe more. Should have it appraised before she gives it away to some charity." The brooch stayed exactly where it was, but from that moment on, it became my test object. I started moving it, documenting its location, waiting to see who noticed and what they'd do. Dr. Patricia Hensley entered my life on day 34, and she changed everything without meaning to. She was my neighbor's daughter, visiting from Chicago, a neurologist who specialized in dementia care. We met at the mailbox by pure chance, or what I let Marcus believe was chance. I'd actually researched her credentials online and timed my mail pickup to coincide with her afternoon walk. "I'm so sorry about your diagnosis," she said, her eyes genuinely kind behind trendy glasses. I blinked at her, confused for real this time. "Diagnosis?" I asked. She looked uncomfortable. "Your son Marcus mentioned you'd been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. I wanted to offer my support, maybe recommend some specialists." My heart started pounding, because this was a line Marcus had apparently crossed without my knowledge, moving from implications to outright medical lies. "I haven't been diagnosed with anything," I said carefully, dropping the confused act entirely for just a moment. Patricia's expression shifted, her professional instincts clearly activating. We talked for 20 minutes, and by the end, I had her card, and she had my private email address, the one Marcus didn't monitor. She didn't ask questions, but her final words stayed with me. "Documentation is everything in cases like this. Everything." The midpoint of my 6-month performance came during a family dinner I insisted on hosting, despite Marcus's obvious reluctance. Rachel had flown in from Portland, and I'd invited Derek, Jennifer, and even Marcus's business partner Tom and his wife. I spent the afternoon cooking dishes I could make in my sleep: lasagna, Caesar salad, garlic bread, while deliberately setting the table wrong, placing forks on the right and knives on the left, mixing up the water and wine glasses. Small errors that someone genuinely confused might make, but while I worked, I listened to Jennifer on the phone in my living room, her voice carrying into the kitchen better than she realized. "By Christmas at the latest," she was saying. "The lawyer said once we have medical documentation of incapacity, we can move forward with the conservatorship. She won't even know it's happening." The lasagna burned slightly that night, on purpose, and I apologized 3 times for my forgetfulness. But under the table my phone sat recording, and upstairs in my bedroom the backup recorder ran continuously. Medical documentation they wanted. Medical documentation that would prove their case was built on fabrication. Rachel found me in the kitchen after dinner, alone for the first time all evening. "Mom, are you really okay?" she asked. And this time I heard something different in her voice. Doubt, maybe, or the beginning of suspicion. I wanted so badly to tell her, to hand her the notebook and the recordings, and let her share the burden of knowing what her brother was planning. But Rachel had her own struggles. A mortgage in Portland, Derek's failed business venture last year, 2 kids in private school they could barely afford. I'd caught Marcus on the phone with her 3 weeks ago, heard him mention Mom's estate and fair distribution in a way that made my stomach turn. Instead of confiding in her, I patted her hand and let my eyes water slightly. "Just tired, sweetie. So tired." She hugged me, and I felt her body relax, accepting the explanation because it was easier than confronting what refusing to accept it would mean. In that moment, I realized I was completely alone in this fight, and the loneliness was almost worse than the betrayal itself. But alone didn't mean helpless. Henry had taught me that too. The brooch disappeared on day 56. I'd moved it to my desk drawer the night before, had filmed myself doing so with my laptop camera, and timestamped the video. The next morning, it was gone. I spent 10 minutes pantomiming confusion, searching in cabinets and coat pockets, while the hidden recorder caught everything, and then Marcus found it in the bathroom medicine cabinet, a place it couldn't possibly have walked to on its own. "Mom, you've got to be more careful," he said, pressing it into my palm with exaggerated patience. I clutched it and nodded, tears, real ones this time, sliding down my cheeks because the casual certainty of his gaslighting was breathtaking. He'd stolen my mother's brooch, hidden it, and then positioned himself as my rescuer, all while building evidence of my incompetence. Jennifer watched from the doorway, her face carefully neutral, but I saw the glance she exchanged with Marcus. They were escalating. The timeline was accelerating. And I needed to speed up my own preparations because whatever they had planned was approaching faster than I'd anticipated. That afternoon, I contacted Patricia Hensley's recommended attorney, a woman named Susan Chen, who specialized in elder abuse cases and conservatorship defense. Susan Chen's office smelled like lemon polish and expensive coffee, nothing like the sterile medical facilities Marcus kept suggesting I visit. I'd told him I was going to a dental appointment, had even Googled the waiting room ambiance of dentist offices so I could describe it convincingly afterward. Susan was 40, sharp-eyed, with a voice that managed to be both gentle and absolutely no-nonsense. "What you're describing is textbook undue influence and possible elder fraud," she said after I'd played her 3 of the recordings. "But you understand that by continuing this performance, you're also taking a risk. If they petition for conservatorship and the court orders evaluation, maintaining the act during that evaluation could backfire. I'd thought about this constantly, the tightrope I was walking between gathering evidence and potentially giving them ammunition. I need enough documentation to prove pattern and intent, I told her. Not just that they said cruel things, but that they systematically constructed a false narrative with the specific goal of seizing control of my assets and person. Susan studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then we need medical documentation of your actual competency, dated throughout this period. And we need to identify witnesses who can testify to the fabrications. We spent 2 hours strategizing, and I left with a recording device that was even better than the ones I'd bought, plus contact information for a geriatric psychiatrist who could provide the competency documentation I'd need when the time came to reveal everything. The all-is-lost moment came on day 83, and it wasn't anything I'd anticipated. Rachel called me, crying, her voice shaking in a way that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with anger. "Mom, I just got off the phone with Marcus," she said. "He told me you've been diagnosed with moderate-stage Alzheimer's, that you've been hiding it from me because you didn't want me to worry. He said he and Jennifer have been managing your care, that you're going to need full-time assistance soon, possibly residential care." This was news to me. Marcus had apparently moved beyond implications to outright medical claims, complete with a non-existent diagnosis. He said you've appointed him as your power of attorney already, that you signed papers last month. I hadn't signed anything. My hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone. "Rachel," I started, then stopped because I was crying too. Real tears of rage and betrayal that I couldn't suppress anymore. "I need to tell you something." And I did. I told her everything. The recordings, the notebook, the 6 weeks of performance, the lies Marcus had constructed. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped, and then she said 5 words that changed the entire trajectory of my plan. "I'm getting on a plane tonight." Rachel arrived at 9:43 that evening, walking into my house with Derek, and a determination I hadn't seen in her face since she was 16 and campaigning for student council. I'd spent the hours waiting for her, alternating between hope and terror that I'd miscalculated, that she'd side with Marcus, that blood would prove thicker than truth. Instead, she walked straight to me and said, "Show me everything." We sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning, my laptop open, recordings playing through external speakers, my notebook spread beside printouts I'd started organizing by theme and date. Derek listened to every word, his expression growing darker with each clip, and when I finally played recording 347, Marcus and Jennifer discussing how much they'd net from selling my house and liquidating my retirement accounts, he stood up abruptly and walked to the window. "We're going to bury him," Derek said quietly, his back still to us. "Legally, completely, appropriately. But we're going to make sure he never does this to anyone else." Rachel was crying again, but this time it was grief for what Marcus had become, for the brother she'd thought she knew. "How did we not see it?" she kept asking. And I didn't have an answer, except that sometimes people showed you only what they wanted you to see, and sometimes love made you willfully blind. The next 3 weeks were a choreographed dance of continued performance and strategic documentation. Rachel stayed in Portland but called me daily, always at times when Marcus wasn't likely to be visiting, and we developed a careful protocol. I continued to decline, even added a few new symptoms, forgetting Rachel's married name, asking what year it was, pretending confusion about the TV remote I could operate in my sleep. But now I had an ally who knew the truth, someone who could serve as witness not just to the recordings, but to my clear competence whenever I dropped the act. We also had Derek, who turned out to have talents I'd never suspected. He was in tech, specifically cybersecurity, and within a week he'd help me set up a cloud backup system that would preserve every recording even if Marcus somehow discovered and destroyed my physical devices. "These files are now in 3 separate secure locations," Derek explained during a video call I took in my locked bedroom. "Even if he somehow got every device you own, we have complete copies with verified timestamps and metadata that proves they haven't been altered." Henry would have loved Derek. Hell, Henry would have loved this entire twisted plan, would have appreciated the meticulous documentation and strategic thinking. I missed him so much in that moment, I had to mute myself until I could breathe normally again. The brooch reappeared in Jennifer's jewelry box, or more accurately, a nearly identical brooch appeared there. Derek had arranged it with a private investigator he knew, someone who'd been trailing Jennifer on the 3 shopping trips she'd taken in the last 2 weeks, allegedly to buy supplies for my future care needs. The investigator photographed her visiting an antique jewelry store, photographed the appraisal document for my mother's original brooch, and photographed her leaving with a receipt. She'd sold my inheritance for $6,200 and pocketed the money while Marcus worked on creating documentation of my incompetence. The replica Derek had made from photographs cost $800, but was good enough to fool Jennifer for now. We placed it back in my jewelry drawer, exactly where the original had been, and waited. When Jennifer next visited, her path to my bedroom was tracked by the small motion-activated cameras Derek had helped install. She opened the drawer, saw the brooch, and her face went paper white. The muttering she did then, standing in my bedroom while I supposedly napped downstairs, became recording number 419. How is it back? I sold it. I sold it and deposited the money. How the hell is it back? She never asked me about it, never mentioned it, because asking would mean admitting she'd stolen it in the first place. Dr. Hensley's evaluation came on day 130, exactly when Susan Chen and I had planned it. I'd called Patricia weeks ago, asked her for a favor, and she'd agreed without hesitation after hearing 30 seconds of one recording. She brought 2 colleagues, both neurologists, and I underwent 3 hours of cognitive testing in her mother's living room, next door to my own house, but far enough from Marcus's surveillance that he couldn't interfere. The tests were exhaustive. Memory, reasoning, language, visual spatial skills, executive function. They asked me to recall lists, draw clocks, solve problems, spell words backward, and repeat increasingly complex instructions. By the end, I was genuinely exhausted, but I'd answered everything correctly, performed every task at or above the level expected for my age and education. The written evaluation Patricia provided 2 days later was beautiful in its clinical precision. Patient demonstrates no signs of cognitive impairment. Memory, reasoning, and executive function all within normal limits for age. No indication of dementia, Alzheimer's disease, or any condition that would impact decision-making capacity. The document was notarized, dated, and referenced the specific tests administered. Susan Chen called it bulletproof and immediately filed it under seal with the court, preparing for the conservatorship petition she knew was coming. Marcus filed the petition on day 147, 3 days before Thanksgiving. I found out because Susan had arranged for immediate notification, but I didn't let Marcus know I knew. Instead, I spent the afternoon pretending to struggle with the TV remote while he sat in my living room, confident and smug, believing he'd already won. The petition claimed I was unable to manage my own affairs, that I posed a danger to myself, that immediate intervention was necessary to protect my assets and well-being. It was accompanied by statements from him and Jennifer describing my alleged deterioration, by a letter from his family physician claiming concern about my cognitive state, and by a request for temporary emergency conservatorship before the hearing could even be scheduled. Reading it, Susan emailed me a copy within an hour of filing, felt like being buried alive, like watching someone seal you into a box while you screamed, but no sound emerged. Except I wasn't screaming. I was documenting. I was waiting. And the box they thought they were sealing me into was actually the one I'd built for them, board by board, recording by recording, over 147 days of patience and performance. The hearing was scheduled for January 8th, the week after New Year's. I marked it on my calendar with a small gold star. Thanksgiving dinner was surreal in ways I couldn't have imagined. Rachel and Derek came, bringing their kids who had no idea their grandmother was pretending to forget their names. Marcus and Jennifer presided over my own table like gracious hosts at someone else's party, serving food I'd cooked, but acting as if they'd orchestrated everything. Jennifer wore a dress I recognized as new, probably purchased with the $6,000 from my mother's brooch, and Marcus gave a toast about family and gratitude that nearly made me sick. But I played my role, dropping my fork once, asking Rachel's daughter what grade she was in after she'd already told me, letting my voice trail off mid-sentence as if I'd forgotten what I meant to say. Under the table, my phone recorded everything, and upstairs, the hidden cameras captured Jennifer slipping into my bedroom during dessert, opening drawers, checking surfaces, clearly searching for the brooch again, unable to believe it had returned. She eventually found it, or rather, found the replica, pinned to a scarf in my closet, and her face when she touched it was priceless. Confusion and fear mixing into something close to panic. I'd moved it there that morning, deliberately, wanting to see her reaction. After dinner, Marcus pulled Rachel aside, his voice low but not low enough. "She's getting worse fast. The conservatorship hearing is January 8th. Don't fight me on this. It's for her own good." Rachel's response was perfect. "Of course, Marcus. Whatever Mom needs." The final month was the longest, filled with moments where I wanted to break character and scream the truth at Marcus, wanted to shake him and ask when exactly he'd decided I was worth more to him as an incompetent ward than as his mother. But I held firm. I continued the daily documentation, continued the performance, and watched as Marcus and Jennifer grew increasingly confident, increasingly careless with what they said around me. They discussed the facility they'd chosen, not the nice assisted living place they'd mentioned, but a Medicaid-funded nursing home 40 minutes away with a reputation for minimal oversight. They discussed selling my house, splitting the proceeds, buying a vacation condo in Florida with Jennifer's share. They discussed how to handle Rachel. "She'll understand once it's done," Marcus said more than once, and I wondered if he truly believed that or if he just didn't care. On Christmas Eve, the brooch disappeared again. This time, I didn't search for it, didn't perform confusion. I simply noted it in my records. Day 178, Mother's brooch stolen, second time. Replica no longer sufficient to dissuade. Expect escalation. The escalation came faster than even I anticipated. On December 30th, Jennifer suggested I should sign a new will, one she'd helpfully drafted that would simplify things and reduce tax burden. I demurred, played confused about what a will even was, and watched her frustration mount. January 8th arrived cold and bright, the kind of winter morning that hurt your teeth when you breathed. I dressed carefully in the suit I'd worn to Henry's funeral, navy blue and perfectly tailored, with my mother's original brooch, the one I'd kept in my safe deposit box since I'd discovered its theft, pinned above my heart. Marcus picked me up at 8:30, assuming I needed his help, his guidance, his presence to navigate the mysterious proceedings he'd initiated. In the car, he coached me gently, as if I were a child. "Just answer the judge's questions as best you can, Mom. Don't worry if you're confused. That's okay. That's why we're doing this, to help you." I nodded docilely, clutching my purse which contained nothing but tissues and hard candy. My real weapons, the laptop, the external drive, the binders of transcripts, the notarized medical evaluations, were already at the courthouse with Susan Chen. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, wood-paneled and formal, with Marcus and Jennifer on one side, Rachel and Derek on the other, and me in the middle with Susan beside me, her hand briefly touching my shoulder as we sat. Marcus looked confident. Jennifer looked eager, and neither of them noticed when the judge entered and Susan stood to address the court that my entire posture had shifted, my expression sharpening from vague confusion to absolute clarity in the space of a heartbeat. "Your Honor," Susan began, her voice clear and carrying, "we're here to oppose the petition for conservatorship filed by Marcus Thornton regarding his mother, Patricia Thornton, who sits before you in full possession of her faculties and has been, in fact, fully competent throughout the entire period Mr. Thornton claims she's been declining." Marcus jerked upright, his expression shocked, and Jennifer's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Susan continued without pause. "Mrs. Thornton has spent the last 6 months documenting a systematic campaign by her son and daughter-in-law to fabricate evidence of cognitive decline, to gaslight her into believing she was incompetent, and to position themselves to seize control of her assets through this conservatorship proceeding. We have 847 audio recordings, detailed written documentation, medical evaluations from 3 board-certified neurologists, and testimony from witnesses who can verify that every incident Mr. Thornton has cited in his petition is either fabricated or misrepresented." She lifted a thick binder onto the table, then another and another, stacking them methodically while the judge watched with increasingly intense focus. "Additionally, we have evidence of theft, specifically a family heirloom valued at over $6,000 that was stolen and sold by Jennifer Thornton, and of elder fraud in the preparation of financial documents that Mrs. Thornton was falsely told were necessary for her care. The judge's expression was unreadable, but he was leaning forward now, his full attention engaged. The next 3 hours were simultaneously the most satisfying and most painful of my life. Susan played selected recordings, each one worse than the last, each one revealing Marcus and Jennifer at their most calculating and cruel. Marcus's voice filled the courtroom. "She won't remember anyway." Jennifer's laugh echoed off the walls. "By Christmas, we'll have everything settled." Their discussions about my house, my money, the nursing home they'd chosen, the plans they'd made for my life without my consent or input, it all spilled out in their own words, time-stamped and undeniable. Marcus tried to interrupt twice, standing and saying, "It wasn't like that. They were just trying to help." But his attorney, clearly blindsided by the recordings, pulled him back down. Jennifer was crying, but they were angry tears, not remorseful ones, and I could see her calculating even now, trying to figure out how to spin this, how to salvage something. Rachel was crying too, quietly, her hand covering her mouth as she listened to her brother's voice proposing to hide assets, to present false medical information to the court, to ensure I was managed properly. The medical evaluations came next. Dr. Hensley's meticulous documentation of my perfect cognitive function, dated throughout the 6 months Marcus claimed I'd been declining, impossible to refute or explain away. The judge called a recess at noon, and Susan hustled me into a small conference room where I finally broke down, sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe. "You did everything right," she kept saying, but I couldn't feel victorious, couldn't feel anything but grief for the son I'd lost somewhere along the way, grief for the relationship that had been so corroded by greed that he'd been willing to imprison me for money. Rachel found us 10 minutes later, held me while I cried, and whispered apologies I didn't need to hear because none of this was her fault. Derek brought coffee, terrible courthouse coffee that tasted like dishwater, and somehow his presence helped more than words could. When we returned to the courtroom, Marcus wouldn't meet my eyes, but Jennifer stared at me with pure hatred, probably realizing that the mother-in-law she'd underestimated, the old woman she'd dismissed as easy prey, had outmaneuvered her completely. The judge asked me if I wanted to address the court, and Susan nodded encouragingly. I stood, smoothed my suit, felt my mother's brooch heavy against my chest, and spoke the words I'd been rehearsing in my head for 6 months. "Your Honor, I'm here to ask that you dismiss this conservatorship petition and recognize it for what it is, an attempt to steal my autonomy, my assets, and my dignity by people I trusted completely until they gave me reason not to." The judge's ruling was swift and unambiguous. The conservatorship petition was denied, with prejudice, meaning Marcus could never file again without extraordinary cause. He ordered Marcus and Jennifer to return any items they'd taken from my home, specifically mentioning the brooch. I'd provided Susan with the receipt from the antique store, the investigator's photos, everything needed to prove the theft beyond doubt. He ordered them to cease all contact with me unless I initiated it, a restraining order in all but name. And then he did something I hadn't expected. He referred the matter to the district attorney's office for investigation of possible elder fraud and exploitation, citing the recordings as evidence of criminal intent, not just civil wrongdoing. Marcus's face went gray, and his attorney started talking rapidly about misunderstandings and family disputes, but the judge wasn't interested. "What I heard on those recordings wasn't family disagreement," he said, his voice hard. "It was predatory behavior targeting a vulnerable population. The DA will determine if charges are warranted." He banged his gavel, and it was over. Marcus and Jennifer left without speaking, their attorney hurrying them out like they were fleeing the scene of a crime, which, legally, they might have been. Rachel hugged me so hard my ribs hurt, and Derek shook Susan's hand with gratitude that made my lawyer smile. And I stood in the emptying courtroom, feeling simultaneously vindicated and hollowed out. The epilogue of my story unfolded over the next 3 months in ways both predictable and surprising. Marcus and Jennifer divorced, apparently the stress of potential criminal charges, plus his discovery that she'd pocketed the money from my mother's brooch without telling him, proved too much for their already shaky foundation. The DA ultimately decided not to prosecute criminally, citing my recovery of assets and the success of the civil proceedings, though both Marcus and Jennifer were required to complete a court-ordered program on elder rights and exploitation. I never spoke to Marcus again, though he sent a letter 6 weeks after the hearing, full of excuses and justifications that couldn't erase 6 months of calculated cruelty. I didn't respond. Some bridges, once burned, shouldn't be rebuilt. Rachel moved back to my city, she and Derek buying a house 3 streets over, close enough to visit but far enough to maintain boundaries, and her presence helped fill some of the empty space Marcus's betrayal had carved out. We had dinner every Sunday, sometimes cooking at her place, sometimes at mine, and slowly the kitchen where I'd performed confusion and weakness became just a kitchen again, a place where I could be fully myself without watching every word and gesture. The 847 recordings sit archived on a secure drive in Susan Chen's office, backed up in 3 locations, preserved as evidence and warning. I kept my notebook, though I haven't opened it since the hearing. I don't need to revisit those entries, don't need to relive the daily heartbreak of documenting my son's transformation into someone I didn't recognize. The brooch, my mother's real brooch recovered from the antique dealer with the judge's order, sits in a shadow box on my mantel now, visible and protected. A reminder that sentimental value can't be measured in the $6,000 Jennifer thought made it worth stealing. I wear it on special occasions, and each time I fasten it, I think about my mother who wore it through a world war and the Great Depression, who would have understood the necessity of fighting back against those who underestimate elderly women. Dr. Hensley became a genuine friend, stopping by for tea once a month, and through her, I connected with a support group for elder abuse survivors, a circle of women and men who understood the specific betrayal of being targeted by your own children, the unique pain of strategic incompetence used as weapon. If you've read this far, if you've stayed with my story through every twist, I hope you'll subscribe to hear others like it, because I've learned I'm far from alone. Comment your city or state below. You'd be surprised how many of us are out there, how many families hide these same dynamics behind closed doors and forced smiles. The symbolic weight of my performance, those 6 months of pretending to forget, stays with me in unexpected ways. Sometimes I catch myself genuinely confused about something small, where I left my reading glasses, what day the recycling gets picked up, and I freeze, momentarily terrified that maybe the act became reality, that faking cognitive decline somehow invited the real thing. But then I remember the crossword puzzle I completed this morning in 12 minutes, the chess game I won last night against an opponent in Singapore, the intricate legal strategy I helped Susan develop for another client she's representing in a similar case. My mind is sharp. My memory is intact. What I lost wasn't cognitive function. It was the illusion that family loyalty is unconditional, that blood relation guarantees protection rather than exploitation. Some people might call my 6-month performance manipulative, might argue I could have confronted Marcus directly, could have prevented the whole nightmare through honesty and open communication. But those people don't understand how gaslighting works, how someone can make you doubt your own reality so thoroughly that by the time you recognize the pattern, you're already halfway into the trap they've built. I needed evidence not just for the court, but for myself. Proof that I wasn't imagining the cruelty, wasn't overreacting to isolated incidents. The recordings gave me that certainty. My house feels different now, lighter somehow despite the heavy knowledge I carry about what almost happened within these walls. I had the locks changed the day after the hearing, symbolic more than practical since Marcus no longer had reason to visit. But I needed the ritual of sealing him out, of reclaiming my space as purely mine. The hidden cameras came down, the recorders were archived, and I slowly stopped checking over my shoulder for evidence of intrusion or theft. Rachel helped me sage the place, a ritual neither of us strictly believed in, but both of us needed, walking through each room with burning herbs and intention, clearing out the lingering energy of surveillance and performance. My bedroom, where Jennifer had repeatedly invaded my privacy, got special attention. New curtains, rearranged furniture, a fresh coat of paint in a shade of blue I'd always wanted, but Henry had gently vetoed. Making the space mine again felt like reclaiming parts of myself I'd locked away during the performance, the woman who didn't have to measure every word and gesture, who could exist without constant documentation and defensive preparation. Derek installed a proper security system, one that notified my phone of any entry, and though I knew Marcus wouldn't violate the restraining order, having that protection let me sleep through the night for the first time in 8 months. Financial recovery took longer than emotional recovery, which surprised me until Susan explained the psychology of economic abuse. Marcus and Jennifer hadn't actually stolen much in concrete terms. The brooch, certainly, and about $3,000 in borrowed cash that Jennifer had taken from my purse over months, always in amounts small enough that I was supposed to attribute to my own confusion rather than theft. But they'd cost me plenty in legal fees, investigator charges, and the price of the recording equipment and security measures I'd needed to protect myself. Susan worked out a settlement where Marcus repaid my legal costs, plus the value of the brooch, money that came from Jennifer's divorce settlement with him. A poetic justice that gave me no pleasure but seemed appropriate. The real cost was trust. The tax on my psyche that made every interaction with service providers or medical professionals fraught with anxiety that I was being manipulated again, that someone else might see my age as opportunity rather than just a number. I caught myself recording phone calls with my insurance company, documenting conversations with my financial advisor, and had to consciously stop, had to remind myself that not everyone was Marcus, that defensive documentation could become its own trap if I let it consume me. Rachel's children, my grandchildren, became unexpected healers in the aftermath. They were 8 and 10, old enough to sense something had shifted in the family, but young enough that explanations could be gentle and age-appropriate. Uncle Marcus made some mistakes, Rachel told them, and they accepted it the way children do, with questions that were practical rather than philosophical. "Will we see him at Christmas?" my grandson asked, and when Rachel said no, he just nodded and went back to his video game. But they noticed I was different. "Grandma, you seem happier," my granddaughter observed one afternoon while we baked cookies. And she was right. Removing the constant weight of performance, of measuring every word and gesture, of maintaining a false self, had freed something in me I hadn't known was caged. I laughed more. I made plans, real plans for travel, for classes I wanted to take, for a garden renovation I'd been postponing for years. I joined a book club and signed up for watercolor lessons and said yes to a dinner invitation from a widower I'd known for years, who'd always been kind, but who I'd kept at arm's length while Henry was alive, while grief was fresh, while I was busy surviving my son's betrayal. The broader implications of my case rippled out in ways I hadn't anticipated. Susan used my recordings in a presentation at a legal conference on elder law, all identifying information removed, and the response led to new training protocols for court investigators in conservatorship cases. Dr. Hensley published a paper on the importance of baseline cognitive testing for seniors, arguing that having documented competency evaluations before crisis made it harder for bad actors to fabricate decline. A local news channel did a story on financial exploitation of elderly parents, interviewing me in shadow with voice distortion, and the tips line got over 200 calls in the week after it aired, each one representing another family navigating similar nightmares. I started volunteering with a legal aid organization, talking to seniors who suspected their children or caregivers of exploitation, walking them through the documentation process I'd learned so painfully. Sitting across from a 78-year-old woman who wept as she described her daughter's theft felt like turning my trauma into purpose. Like Henry's legal training passed through me had found its proper application decades after I thought I'd set it aside for domesticity and motherhood. Each person I helped document their case, each recording I taught them how to make safely and legally, felt like honoring the version of myself who'd spent 6 months being someone she wasn't in service of truth. The question I get asked most, both by the people I counsel and by the friends who eventually learned my story, is whether I regret the performance itself, whether I wish I'd confronted Marcus directly instead of spending half a year pretending incompetence. The answer is complicated, layered, not reducible to simple yes or no. I regret that it was necessary, regret that my son had degraded to the point where such extreme measures became my best option for self-protection. I regret the toll it took on my relationship with Rachel, who had to reconcile her brother's betrayal with her own failure to see it, who carried guilt she didn't deserve for months after the hearing. I regret the loneliness of those 6 months, the isolation of carrying knowledge I couldn't share, of performing confusion while my actual mind raced with strategy and documentation and fear. But I don't regret the decision itself, the choice to fight back with intelligence and patience rather than confrontation that would have given Marcus warning, time to adjust his approach, opportunity to paint me as paranoid or vindictive. The recordings were irrefutable in ways my word alone would never have been. They protected me, not just legally, but psychologically, providing external validation that the gaslighting was real, the cruelty was intentional, and my perception of events was accurate despite my son's constant attempts to convince me otherwise. 1 year after the hearing, I threw myself a party. Not a birthday, not a holiday, just a celebration of survival and reclamation that I called the Unforgetting. Rachel helped me plan it, and we invited everyone who'd been part of my defense or recovery: Susan Chen and her paralegal, Derek and the kids, Dr. Hensley and her colleagues who'd performed my evaluations, even the private investigator who'd tracked Jennifer to the antique store. We ate too much, drank reasonable amounts because we were all getting older and hangovers hit harder, and at one point, Susan raised her glass and said, "To Patricia, who proved that documentation beats manipulation every time." Everyone cheered, and I felt something in my chest loosen and expand, some final piece of armor I'd been wearing since those first recordings clicking off and dissolving. I made a speech, brief because I'm not comfortable being the center of attention, thanking everyone for their roles in my liberation. That was the word I used, liberation, because that's what it had been. Freedom from a cage I hadn't realized I was in until I'd started systematically recording the bars. And I ended with this: if you suspect someone you love is trying to make you doubt your own mind, trust that suspicion. Document everything. Ask for help. And remember that being elderly doesn't mean being helpless. It just means you've lived long enough to recognize patterns that younger people still think are coincidences. The recordings themselves, those 847 conversations, remain the strangest legacy of the experience. I've never listened to most of them past the initial review for transcription and legal filing. I don't need to hear Marcus's voice explaining to Jennifer how they'll split my assets, don't need to relive the casual cruelty of their discussions about managing me. But knowing they exist, knowing they're preserved and backed up and available if ever needed again, provides a security I didn't expect. They're evidence, certainly, but they're also memory made objective, proof that can't be revised or reinterpreted by time and emotion. Henry used to say that memory was the least reliable witness, that people remembered events through the lens of present feeling, reshaping past to fit current narrative. The recordings are immune to that revision. They capture moment and tone and exact phrasing in ways that can't be softened or excused or explained away. Sometimes I think about destroying them, about erasing the evidence of Marcus's worst self and freeing us both from its existence. But then I remember the woman who might call the legal aid hotline tomorrow, who might need to hear that documentation is possible, that evidence can be gathered, that fighting back is an option. And I keep them archived and secure, available as template and proof. Marcus lives 2 states away now, relocated for work or escape or both. I'm not sure which, and I've stopped trying to guess his motivations. He sends birthday cards each year, generic Hallmark sentiments with signatures, but no personal messages, and I don't respond. Rachel sees him occasionally at holidays, maintaining minimal contact for reasons she doesn't fully explain, and I don't push her to justify. She's building her own relationship with her brother, separate from my experience with him, and I respect that boundary even as I worry about her being hurt again. Derek promises me he watches for red flags, that he and Rachel have open communication about Marcus's behavior, that they've established financial safeguards that prevent any potential exploitation. I believe him. Trust, I've learned, isn't binary. It exists in degrees and contexts, and the trust I extend to Rachel and Derek is different from but no less real than the trust I once gave Marcus before he shattered it. My therapist, who I started seeing 3 months after the hearing, says I'm doing well considering that my ability to maintain relationships and extend trust despite betrayal indicates resilience rather than damage. I'm not sure I believe her completely, but I show up to sessions and do the work, and slowly the hypervigilance fades into something more manageable. The final accounting of those 6 months yields numbers that feel both precise and inadequate. 847 recordings, each representing a moment where truth was sacrificed for performance, where I heard my son's real thoughts and had to pretend ignorance while documenting evidence. 6 months of daily performance, 182 days of being someone I wasn't, of calculated confusion and strategic weakness, $23,000 in legal fees and investigator costs, money that bought justice but couldn't purchase back the relationship I'd lost. 3 medical evaluations, each one proving what I already knew, that my mind was intact, my memory sharp, my competence undeniable despite Marcus's fabricated narrative. 1 brooch recovered, its monetary value trivial compared to its symbolic weight, its return representing not just recovered property, but validated reality. 7 people who I now consider genuine friends, relationships forged in crisis and maintained through choice, each one a reminder that betrayal by one doesn't preclude trust in others. And 1 son lost, or perhaps 1 son revealed, the difference between those framings too painful to examine too closely. The arithmetic of trauma and recovery doesn't balance neatly. What was taken can't be fully restored by what was gained, but the equation tips toward survival, toward agency, toward a future I authored rather than one Marcus attempted to impose. My mother's cameo brooch sits on my dresser now, close enough to see daily, but no longer requiring the protective distance of a shadow box. I touch it most mornings while I dress, a ritual that grounds me in lineage and survival. She wore it through poverty and war, through my father's death when I was 12 and her long widowhood that followed. She wore it to my wedding and to Henry's funeral, and she gave it to me 3 days before she died with instructions that were simple and direct. Don't let anyone tell you it's just jewelry. It's proof that women survive. I didn't understand then. Thought she was being sentimental about an object that, while beautiful, was ultimately replaceable. But she was right in ways I couldn't have predicted. The brooch became the tangible symbol of everything Marcus tried to take: inheritance, memory, connection to matrilineal strength, proof that I was someone's daughter before I was someone's mother, that my identity existed independent of the roles others needed me to fill. Jennifer saw $6,000 in evaluated gold and craftsmanship. She missed the fact that some things carry value that can't be appraised, that stealing them marks you as someone who fundamentally misunderstands what matters. When I pinned it to my suit on the day of the hearing, I felt my mother's presence more strongly than I had in the 20 years since her death, felt her approval and her fury on my behalf, felt the long chain of women who'd refused to be diminished by others' expectations. The watercolor class I joined became an unexpected source of renewal, a space where incompetence was expected and improvement was celebrated rather than weaponized. My paintings are mediocre at best, muddy colors and uncertain brushstrokes, but the act of creation without performance felt revolutionary after 6 months of calculated confusion. Nobody in class knew my story, and I didn't share it. I was just Patricia, the woman who mixed too much water with her pigments and occasionally painted outside the lines with more enthusiasm than skill. The teacher, a patient woman in her 30s named May, praised my bold choices when I accidentally created a sunset that looked vaguely radioactive, and I laughed genuinely for the first time in months. I brought Rachel one of my paintings, a lopsided vase of flowers that looked like they were melting, and she framed it and hung it in her kitchen where her children could see their grandmother trying something new, failing without fear, persisting despite obvious lack of talent. "This is my favorite thing you've ever made," Rachel told me, and when I protested that it was objectively terrible, she shook her head. "It's you being yourself without worrying about what anyone thinks. It's perfect." Derek agreed, and somehow, my incompetence at watercolor became the antidote to the months I'd spent performing incompetence at life, the difference between genuine limitation and strategic performance, clarifying something I'd needed to understand about authenticity and survival. The elderly widower who invited me to dinner, whose name is Thomas, and who taught literature before retirement, has become a comfortable presence in my weeks, without becoming an obligation or expectation. We meet for coffee, attend concerts, argue amiably about books and politics, And he knows my story because Rachel insisted I tell him before we got too involved. No secrets this time, Mom. He should know what happened. Thomas listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said simply, "Your son is a fool who destroyed something irreplaceable for something temporary. His loss. We don't talk about Marcus much, but Thomas's presence reminds me that trust remains possible, that not every relationship has to be weighted with history and trauma, that starting over is an option even at 73. We've been to the symphony twice, out to dinner maybe a dozen times, and once he kissed me goodnight at my door with a gentleness that made me cry after he left, mourning Henry and grateful for Thomas in equal measure." Rachel approves. The kids call him Grandma's friend Thomas, with the straightforward acceptance children bring to adult relationships. And I'm learning that companionship can be its own form of healing, that sharing space with someone who sees your present rather than your past allows different versions of yourself to emerge. The legacy of those 6 months continues to unfold in ways both mundane and profound. In the nervous laugh I sometimes give when someone asks me to repeat myself, worried they think I'm confused, when really I just spoke too softly. It shows in the way I document everything now, not pathologically, but carefully, saving emails, keeping receipts, maintaining records that create paper trails of ordinary transactions, because I've learned how easily reality can be contested without proof. It appears in the volunteer work that's become central to my week, sitting across from other elderly people who suspect their children or caregivers of exploitation and saying words I needed to hear 6 months before everything exploded. Your suspicion is probably right. Here's how to document it. You're not alone. It lives in the relationship with Rachel that's somehow stronger than before, built now on shared knowledge of how families can fracture and conscious choice to prevent that fracturing from spreading. And it exists in the silence where Marcus used to be. Negative space that's somehow louder than his presence ever was. A reminder that sometimes love means protecting yourself from people who stopped being safe, even though they continue being family. None of this resolves neatly. There's no moment where everything makes sense, or stops hurting, or transforms into simple lessons. But there's survival, there's agency, and there's the daily choice to be fully myself without performance or pretense, which turns out to be enough. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, through 847 conversations and 6 months of performance and the legal battle that followed, thank you. Subscribe if you haven't already. I'll be back with more stories about survival and strategy, about elderly women who refuse to be dismissed or diminished, about the small rebellions and large victories that happen when we trust our instincts and document our truth. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, what state or city you call home, because building community around these stories matters almost as much as the stories themselves. We survive isolation through connection, through knowing others have walked similar paths and emerged intact, if not unscathed. My story ended with justice, but justice isn't the same as healing, and healing isn't the same as forgetting. The recordings remain archived. The brooch sits on my dresser. Rachel comes for Sunday dinner. Thomas texts me silly memes about literature that make me smile. And I wake up each morning in a house that's fully mine, in a life I defended paragraph by paragraph and recording by recording. And I'm grateful for the woman I became in the process of refusing to become what Marcus needed me to be. That's enough. That's everything.